Welcome to day two of the Hormel Gifted and Talented Education Symposium. It's wonderful to see each and every one of you. Thank you for joining us again. And it is my great honor to welcome you on behalf of the Minnesota Department of Education. My name is Wendy Behrens. I'm the State Gifted and Talented Education Specialist, and it is my great honor to collaborate with the Austin Public School District as well as the Hormel Foundation. Without their support, this event would not be possible. Before I go farther, I want to say thank you not only to you, but to our presenters and the planning team for Gifted and Talented Symposium, as well as the crew at Spot Me, our platform. Everybody has contributed to this event, and it takes an entire village to make it a successful one. Hopefully, next year, we'll see you in person, but until then, enjoy the full extent of the symposium. Just a few reminders before we go to our keynote today. Please attend the same sessions that you attended yesterday. This is our way of modeling continuous improvement and what we know, what is evidence-based about professional learning is that it's not a one and done that's effective. We know that it's learning that takes place over time. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that on Thursday, tomorrow, for day 3 of the symposium, we do have a schedule change. And this has been our schedule, but it's a little different than what you've experienced yesterday and what you'll experience today. Tomorrow we begin with session 3. So those of you who have been attending a session at 2:30 yesterday and today will attend it at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow. And we're doing that so that we can have a closing keynote. So tomorrow, during session 3, we hope that you'll join us at 2:30 for a really interesting presentation by S.C. Says, a slam poet, who will be talking with us about empathy, among other things. It's one session I'm sure you'll find unique, and we certainly hope that you'll be with us. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our very, very special guest today. Our keynote is Dr. Eleonoor van Gerven, who comes to us from the Netherlands, where she's a teacher education, where she works in teacher preparation, and she has specialized in gifted education and the systemic change and solution-based approach. She's developed a competency matrix for curriculum construction in the domain of gifted education for a continuous professional development of teachers. She developed the postgraduate teacher education specialist in gifted education for the Netherlands and postmaster teacher education courses. In addition to her many articles, publications, Eleonoor is a well-respected and often in high demand presenter, not only through Europe, but also in the United States. I can assure you that you will find her presentation to be both informative and provocative. Thank you all for joining us, and most especially to Eleonoor van Gerven. Hello, Eleonoor.
Hello, Wendy. I'm so pleased that you invited me, and I'm really pleased to meet all the people who are joining us today. And I hope we will have a wonderful session together. Okay, this is the point where I take over and where I start. Well, Wendy has done a beautiful introduction of me, and that makes me feel slightly anxious because now I have to live up to a certain standard. But there's nothing wrong with being a bit anxious. at all. The title of my presentation is Underachievement is So 2020. A news flash, because a new perspective is required. And I might want to, I might ruffle some feathers, and I don't want to offend anybody, but we Dutch people are fairly direct. So if I say something that you find slightly annoying or it might ruffle your feathers, just keep in mind, bear with me. I'm Dutch, I'm direct, but it comes straight from my heart. And my heart is and mind is for those children who need a little bit more advocacy for their education than maybe other children. So let's start from that point. And by now you may have spotted that I have a severe accent and that I'm not a native speaker. So at some points I will struggle to find the right words, as I decided not to write my keynote down, but just go with the flow. Okay, coming from the Netherlands, what can I tell you? Just one slide, a little bit about the Netherlands. And it's just a very short story about what I'm proud of and where I find prejudice in how people think that we live and we are. And let's start with our schools. This is not a standard school building, but it is a school building. But it tells you a tiny little bit about the schools, because we have 7,000 primary schools in the Netherlands. And about 800 of those schools are for special educational needs children. And that does not include gifted education. Gifted education falls without the Dutch scope of special educational needs schools. So it should be somewhere included in those 6,200 other schools. The average primary school in the Netherlands has 230 students. In each class, 28 to 38 students and one teacher. And inclusion is the Dutch gospel. And we moved away from exclusion via segregated groups into integration and now inclusion. And inclusion for us means together when possible, but segregated if necessary. And here you see our beautiful tulip fields. And those tulip fields for me represent all the different children we have in our classrooms. And if we see this field as one classroom, wow, we see many differences and many different educational needs that one teacher here at the far end at the mill has to address. Because gifted education is not included in our pre-service teacher education. Takes about 2 hours I think 2 hours in 4 years. Hardly any teacher education institute has a minor for pre-service teachers in gifted ed. So it is really, really an unexplored field. So whenever Dutch teachers are confronted with gifted children, they have to start their post-service continuous professional education, and that's where we pick up. In the Netherlands, funding for school psychologists, counselors, school counselors, etc. is really limited, and hardly any primary school has a specific school counselor or a school psychologist. That has consequences for the way how we identify gifted learners. What we do have in all schools is that there is one full-time SEN coordinator per 8 groups. And sometimes schools have a specialist in gifted education as compared to the special educational needs coordinator, but that is still a luxury. In the Netherlands, also the definition of specialist in gifted education varies. And what do I mean with that? Sometimes I see that a school says we do have a specialist in gifted education, and when I contact the school or when I'm in touch with that person might have had a 2-year training, a 1-year training, or maybe only 2-hour training. So the the terminology, the notion of specialist in gifted education is not one that is limited by certain boundaries. What is also important is that the definition of giftedness is left to the discretion of each school. That means per school, per district, per county, the definition of giftedness may differ. And that implies that if you have your child at school A and you're about to move to another city, and your child goes to school B, where he's seen at school A as gifted, school B may not see the same, may not use the same definition, and may not see your child as gifted at all, or vice versa. Consequently, all our teachers in the Netherlands are specialists in do-it-yourselves when it comes to gifted education. Now, where's my pride? I'm very proud of this chap. This is Rembrandt, and this is one of the most important painters, most talented painters we've had in the Netherlands. And I'm really proud. This one is a Dutch fellow. It is a perfect example of a brilliant and gifted person. And where's prejudice? Whenever I speak to people from other countries, they think we all walk on wooden shoes. I may disappoint you, but we don't walk on wooden shoes any longer. However, when I grew up, and I grew up in the area near the tulip fields, when we came out of school, we left our nice leather shoes out inside, and when we were outside and we played in the garden or in the fields, yes, at that time, many, many years ago, my children would say it's about 3 million years ago, we walked on wooden shoes, but now we don't any longer. Well, having said the stage for how I think about giftedness, how I think about gifted education and underachievement, I'd like to go along. And it's a bit like hashtag too bad, too sad, because the 5 messages I have may be slightly disappointing for you. And we start with the fact that there's no universal definition of giftedness. Secondly, I'd like to address that there are different perspectives of underachievement and the consequences that comes along with it. There's no such thing as the underachieving student, and the label of underachiever implies a value judgment, and hence a paradigm shift is needed. But there's also hope for the future, and that hope, in my opinion, is focused in the change-oriented approach. Now let's start with hashtag too bad, too sad, and no universal definition of giftedness. Different perspectives, and this is research done by Diane Chen. They're way over my head in analyzing what goes on in all the different theories. As I'm a teacher educator, and I hardly have any time left for doing very intense research. But Diane Chen did a nice bit of research, and they say, well, there are different perspectives on giftedness, and each perspective leads to different expectations of our gifted learners, of our teachers of the gifted learners, but it also leads to different interventions, straightforward into how we address the educational needs of our students, but also different interventions in how we educate our teachers about gifted education. And different perspectives on giftedness lead to different focuses within our educational needs support system. Because if you have a different expectation and you have different interventions, you can't deal with one educational needs support system. So depending on the perspective on gifted education people take on, that makes changes or differences in how we respond to it. Most of you have a pretty good understanding of the different perspectives on gifted education, and Diane Chen referred to the so-called gifted child paradigm, and within that paradigm, they stated that, and they cited the Columbus Group, and they stated that giftedness is an asynchronous development in which advanced cognitive abilities and heightened intensity combine to create inner experiences and awareness that qualitatively differ from the norm, and this asynchrony increases with higher intellectual capacity. And the uniqueness of the gifted renders them particularly vulnerable and requires modification in parenting, teaching, and counseling in order for them to develop optimally. So this is one paradigm on gifted education. And keep in mind, it's not about what I prefer, it's about the differences from a theoretical point of view and what it implies to a more practical point of view. I'll get back to that later on. The second paradigm Diane Chen distinguishes what they call the so-called talent development paradigm. And in that paradigm, they define giftedness as the manifestation of performance or production that is clearly at the upper end of the distribution in a talent domain, even relative to that of other higher functioning individuals in that domain. And further, giftedness can be viewed as developmental, in that in the beginning stages, potential is the key variable, and in later stages, achievement is the measure of giftedness. And in fully developed talents, eminence is the basis on which the label is granted. Psychosocial variables play an essential role in the manifestation of giftedness at every developmental stage, and both cognitive and psychosocial variables are malleable and need to be deliberately cultivated. Now, if you take a look at both perspectives, the gifted child paradigm and the talent development paradigm, you will see there are different accents. In the first paradigm, it's really focused on the child and the student's being. In the second paradigm, it is about developing something that you were born with, but that needed to be nurtured to be able to grow. Now, there's also a third paradigm, and the third paradigm is focused on what they call the so-called differentiation paradigm. And within that differentiation paradigm, and again, I refer to Diane Chen, they cite Matthews and Foster, and they say giftedness is the exceptionally advanced subject-specific ability at a particular point in time, such that a student's learning needs cannot be well met without adaptations to the curriculum. Now, this is a completely different paradigm, and this paradigm matches more, at least what goes on in the Netherlands now, a movement towards a more inclusive approach, where we try to address gifted learners without labeling them as such, or at least we try to address them without labeling them as such, and without asking very complex, as I always say, entrance tickets, as in what do you need before you are allowed, or what traits do you have to exhibit before you are allowed to a different curriculum. And each paradigm has its own consequences on the way we look at achievement, and I'll get back to that. Now, back to hashtag too bad, too sad, because there are also different perspectives on underachievement. And underachievement, defining underachievement is really complicated, because if you make it too broad, you will get a wide group of students that may be suspected of underachieving, as in they may underachieve, and we may get a large group. But if you define the group too narrow, you might fail to identify underachieving students. What we sometimes see in our schools is that finding that balance between a broad definition or a more narrow definition is really complicated, because it also refers to the way how we communicate with parents as teachers, about the abilities of their students, about the achievements of their students, of their children, and the way we see it in our construct. And sometimes teachers say, well, parents have a definition of underachievement that is way too broad. And sometimes parents say, our schools have definitions on underachieving and giftedness that is way too narrow because they exclude our child. And it shows you how complex it is, and that making the connection between theory and practice is of the utmost importance. Now, if I go back to those two first paradigms, and I look at the gifted child paradigm and I look at the talent development paradigm, Secret and my coach in 2017 wrote an article, and they say, well, if you look at the different paradigms, you see that at first, on the left-hand side, we see the gifted child paradigm, and they say underachievement is about not working, those children not working to their ability and failing in self-actualization. That is the main focus for their definition. And on the other hand, they point out that the talent development paradigm states that underachievement is about a failure to develop advanced academic skills, which they initially demonstrate. So that is the developmental potential showed in their primary years. It's about an untapped potential that failed to materialize. And what I think that is most important, they refer to a discrepancy between what is and what might be. And in this perspective, underachievement is representing a lost talent. And again, it's not about who's right or wrong, but it's about what it implies and what consequences there are for your definition of underachievement. Now, what are we talking about? Because I told you what it's not. So maybe it becomes time to talk about what it is. Well, if you look at the characteristics of definitions, and I read quite a lot of articles over the last couple of years on underachievement, what we can state at least is that low achievements do not equal underachievement. Not every student that gets low achievements or achieves not as highly as we expect him to do is immediately an underachiever. Because if you are still learning, if you are still not learning, implies that you're not capable yet. And if you're not capable yet, it's quite logic that you would not achieve highly for the first time you do things. Sometimes teachers think that if you are gifted, whenever you touch anything, it turns into gold. No, that's not true. The fact that you're gifted doesn't mean that you don't have to learn things. It only means that when you are learning things, you can learn them at a greater pace and that you can learn them maybe more in depth. But learning still takes place from being unconsciously incompetent toward being consciously incompetent toward being consciously competent and unconsciously competent. And during that process between being consciously incompetent and consciously competent, there takes learning place. And that means that if you fail in that process, that's not underachieving, that is still learning. The second bullet refers to that not every observed discrepancy between the ability of a child and the achievement indicates underachievement, because there's still, even if it takes over, it persists for a longer period of time, it has to focus on major discrepancies. It's not a minor, it should be a biggie, as we would say. And what we see in all those definitions on underachievement is that the influence of diagnosed or undiagnosed learning disabilities should be excluded from the definition of being an underachiever. I sometimes find books that have a title as in able underachievers. And when I open up the book and I start reading the book, I think this is not about underachievers. This is about having a learning disability. And the fact that you're gifted and you may have a dyslexia or dyscalculia, or you are on the autism spectrum disorder, or you have characteristics of ADHD, that does not equal underachievement, because most of those learners do their utmost best and they invest a lot in themselves to achieve as high as they can. The fact that they don't meet our expectations has nothing to do with the fact that they're underachieving. It has to do with the fact that their learning differences or learning disabilities, whatever you prefer, or developmental differences, throws up thresholds that are very complicated to overcome, and they need our help to overcome them. However, this doesn't mean that if you are a 2E learner that you cannot underachieve, but you might you might underachieve in the domains that are not affected by your learning disability or your developmental differences. But it's very unlikely that you will become or be an underachievement in the domains that are affected. Now, if you take a look at a worldwide accepted definition, and this one dates from Rees and McCoach from 2000, and they state underachievers are students who exhibit a severe discrepancy between expected achievement, as measured by standardized test scores or intellectual capacity assessment, and actual achievement, as measured by class grades and teacher evaluations. And to be classified as an underachiever, the discrepancy between expected and actual achievement must not be the direct result of a diagnosed learning disability and must persist over an extended period of time. And gifted underachievers are underachievers who exhibit superior scores on measures of expected achievement and test scores or cognitive and intellectual assessments. Now, that is quite a definition, and basically everything I told you before was included in this definition. So it's not done, it's not well done, Rees and McCoach, but it's well done that I summarized it on the previous slide. Now, hashtag too bad, too sad 3, because the underachieving student does not exist, because if we have seen this definition, we might expect that underachieving students are fairly easy to categorize, but they are a heterogeneous group, and they also differ from high-performing gifted learners. And there's done a research, it's 20 years ago, but it's really interesting. It's done by Pomerantz and Pomerantz, and they interviewed gifted underachieving students, and most of them said that they didn't feel at ease in a group where, or in a project where the other students were well performing and high performing gifted students, because they said themselves, we differ more from them than we differ from each other. So yeah, now what does it tell us? Basically, throw all your checklists in the bin, because they don't work. Checklists suggest a false security, as in, if I have a list and I know the characteristic, I can tick all the boxes, yes, you're in, or too bad to sad, I can't tick all the boxes, no, you're not in. What you do need to do is spot the differences, because what do we know from wider research? And this is not a checklist. These are observations made by several researchers, not only by Siegel and McCoach, but by a wide large of researchers. And they say, well, what you may find, but you also may not find it, but what you may find is that some underachieving students have a low academic self-perception. Some of them may experience a very low self-efficacy. They may experience low self-motivation. You may find that they are externally attributing the failure of success. You may experience a low goal valuation. You may experience a negative attitudes towards school and teachers, and you may experience low self-regulatory or metacognitive skills. But you also, but it's not so that you will find that. It's even so that you may find children who do not tick any of these boxes. But what it's about spot the differences between all those different students. Now, too bad, too sad, because the label of underachiever implies a value judgment. Take a look at what I did here. Unless you're colorblind, you have a difficulty reading it, I realized later on. But if you look at this, it's about underachievers exhibit, over a longer period of time, a severe discrepancy between what we expect them to achieve and their actual achievement. Now, talking about external attribution, I think this is a very good example of that sentence. It's about their expectations that lag behind our expectations. And to be classified as an underachiever, this difference between our expectation and their achievement may not be caused by a diagnosed learning disability. When I was in teacher education training myself, I had an educator that told me, if you point out one finger to a student, there are three fingers pointing at yourself. And basically, for me, the label of underachieving is pointing out, you don't meet my expectation. And I think that is a perfect example of child blaming. Because using the word underachieving places unacceptable student behavior in the spotlight. It's not what we accept, it's not what we expect. We want something more. However, every cloud has a silver lining, because the notion of underachievement refers to behavior. It does not refer to developmental potential. And what we all know as teachers, behavior is a message. Behavior is the result of the interplay between a person and their ecological system. And that's where we connect to yesterday's lecture about Bronfenbrenner's theory. And I'll get back to that in the next couple of slides, because the effect of the ecological system on what students do on their behavior is enormous. And as every cloud has a silver lining, a paradigm shift is needed, because the current educational paradigms, they focus on learning, on a systemic approach, and on a solution-focused approach. And that implies that we may need new terminology and a new perspective on what we up until now have called underachievement. Learning as core business of education. Gert Pista in 2014 wrote a beautiful book about the risk of education. And he said, basically, education is about three things. It's about qualification, as in the knowledge and skills that are offering me as a student the chances for participating in society. It's about socialization, the me in the context of the future society. So where do I go, and what parts can I take on in that society? And the me, and it's about subjectification, and that is about learning how to become a person, as in the me in a transformational context. Who am I? In the Netherlands in the 50s, we had a psychologist, or a pedagogue basically, and named Langeveld, and he said, subjectification is about being self-responsible towards what you do with your talent, and that it's not only about actualizing your personal potential, but it's about actualizing your personal potential in a way that is wise and contributes to the greater good of society. And basically, now it's being brought up as a very new perspective on education, a transformational context. And that brings us to a new definition. And that brings us to my definition, the word underlearning. Underlearning refers to a learning process wherein the student's developmental potential is less stimulated than preferable. Consequently, the student's achievements represent a learning process characterized by a mismatch between the student's developmental potential and the student's educational needs to actualize that potential. And hence, the notion of underlearning does not refer to the student and their achievement, but qualifies the interplay between the ecological system and the learning process. Now, that's quite a mouthful, isn't it? Let's take a look at that student's ecological system. And we saw some wonderful graphics yesterday. This is a graphic I made a couple of years ago. And I just included the elements that you as a teacher may be of influence at a relatively short notice. And what you will see is that we've placed the student in the center of this system. And that doesn't mean that the student is at the center of the earth, but it's about if this child with this teacher and this physical learning environment, this curriculum, these peers, and this family is in my classroom, and I have for one moment to focus on this student, how can we all contribute? And how can I, as a teacher, become the director, maybe the orchestrator of a good education and a good curriculum, proper instructional strategies, etc. And what I see is reading all those articles on underachievement, they all refer to the same different factors of the system as possible triggers for underachievement. And at some point I realized that is strange. They all point them out as triggers, but none of the definitions include the triggers as cause of what goes on. And it has to do with the fact that it's not only one cause, but it's the interplay between the ecological system. And that means that as a teacher, you do not only affect the student, or your physical learning environment does not only affect the student, but all the actors in the ecological system affect each other. And in doing so, they also affect the student, and vice versa, the student affects you. Almost 40 years, when I started out as a 40 years ago, when I started out as a kindergarten teacher, there was a child in my classroom and who played with some wooden blocks, and he was trying to build things from an example. And I noticed that the example that we gave him was far too easy, because I saw him, it was his second day at school, I saw him counting how many bricks he needed before he was even grabbing the bricks and building the building that he wanted to make. So I gave him some other materials, and I noticed that he was sitting straight up, and the lights in his eyes turned on. And in my response, adjusting a tiny little bit of the curriculum, the student woke up more or less, and he came into a flow, and he started to build, and he started to include other students. And when he went home, he said to his parents, "I've had the best day ever, because I learned that if you've learned to build something, you can always learn to build something new, something more complex." I loved it. And at that point, the family bought him some additional bricks, and then he started to build things at home and brought them with them at school and showed me what he did with it. Well, that is interaction, that is interplay between the ecological system. If you take an ecological perspective from the same definition I just gave you, you refer to underlearning, it's as a learning process wherein the student's developmental potential is less stimulated than preferable. And consequently, the student's achievements represent a learning process characterized by a mismatch between the student's developmental potential and the student's educational needs to actualize their potential. Hence, the notion of underachievement does not refer to the student and their achievement, but qualifies the interplay between the ecological system and the learning process. Now, there's also hope for the future, and in my perspective, that is the change-oriented approach. And in that perspective, it's not about is the glass half full or half empty. The only relevant question is where to find the tap. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the last 10 minutes of this afternoon. Now, how do we get there? First, you have to identify ownership between the educational partners, because a problem is not always present. So what you start to do is you start to find the exception. And what you also do is you explore that exception and you learn from it. If a strategy works, apply it more often. If a strategy doesn't work and you've tried it consequently over a longer period of time, then you let it go. And that implies that you end up in a cyclic process of 7 steps. And I'm going to address each and every step. Step 1, and you will see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Step 1, you start to analyze the problematic situation. What do you all experience as a shared concern? Because I can find something as a problem, but as long as the student doesn't experience it as a problem, or parents don't experience it as a problem, fat chance that something is about to change. So what is the shared concern? Because you are going to define that as the problematic situation, and then you define how every ecological system, and I make a distinction between factors and actors. Factors is the learning environment, is your curriculum, and actors are peers, family, and you as a teacher and the student. And how do they each contribute to the current situation? And if you make that analysis, stick to the facts, stay objective. So if you see the child looking outside the window while he's doing his math, don't tell me that he's daydreaming, because you don't know if he's daydreaming, because you don't know what goes on in his head. So you stay objective and you leave your value judgments about each and everybody's role out of the conversation, because as soon as you let those value judgments and emotions creep into the conversation, you end up in having a very complex conversation, and that's not constructive at all. Step number 2. Now, if you've defined the problem, then what is the shared need for change? What do you want to change? And be as specific as possible. And discuss with each other, why do we consider this change as an improvement? Because I can find it an improvement that a child is able to work for an hour on this comprehensive reading, while the child may be bored to death with comprehensive reasoning and don't consider it as an improvement at all. So somewhere the truth might lie in the middle. Step number 3, make an analysis of a positive situation. And that refers to the fact that a problem is not always present. So try to find when is the problem less severe or not there at all. And don't tell me it's there the entire day, but on each and every day there are at least 30 seconds that the problem is not there. Is that when a child comes into your classroom? Is it when he leaves your classroom? Is it does it not occur during math, but does it occur during history, or vice versa? Does it not occur while he's working with Johnny and Mary, but does it occur when he's working with Layla and Perina? Well, find that successful situation. And then you did the same analysis as in step 1. How does every factor in the ecological system contribute to that situation? And again, you stick to the facts, you stay objective, and you leave your judgments and emotions outside of the conversation. Step number 4, you start digging for gold, because if you compare both situations and you start pointing out the similarities and pointing out the differences, you will find what or which of these differences may contribute to the success. It might be that the child is sitting at another place in the classroom. It might be at another moment at the day, during the day. It might be not with you, but with your coworker. It might be not after his mummy weekend, as in divorced parents and having stayed with mother, or his daddy weekend, having stayed with daddy on Monday. And what you do is, at those moments that you are successful, the differences are proof of that you are already competent, that you were able to tune in into the student's needs, that you were able to address what a child needed, that the curriculum was a fit, that the physical environment was a fit. So digging for gold means we are going to find the things that we are already competent in. And in a solution-focused and change-oriented approach, you are going to use that specific competence. And in step number 5, you do that by using a thermometer. And you start with the defined need for change, because that is the 10 on your scale. That is what you want to achieve. And then you rate the problematic situation compared to that 10. And you define what legitimizes your rating in positive language. It's already a 4. I rate it as a 4. Yeah, okay, good. Why is it already a 4? Well, that is because the curriculum is at least in the domain of his interest. And the parents are interested in what the student is trying to learn. As a teacher, I'm already able to do the basic instruction, but I'd like to do some more while the student is executing the task. In my physical learning environment, we have a computer, and our student loves to work at a computer, and the peers and so on. And you focus and you stipulate those ratings in positive language. And the next step, and that is the most difficult step you're going to take. As a teacher, your worries about the child are this big. And I only allow you to design an intervention that is this big. Because if you design an intervention like this, if I were a child or I were your coworker, I would ask for mobility services, as in, can I leave the room because this is way too big. So what you're going to do is you aim for the smallest step, and you describe how your rating can improve by only 1 point. My 4 becomes a 5 if the curriculum is not only in the domain the student is interested in, but it's also being delivered in small chunks that the student is able to oversee. My 4 becomes a 5 if the parents are not only interested in what a child is about to learn, but if we can make an agreement about not to nag on the days that things are not going that well. It becomes a 5 if I, as a teacher, do not only have the time for a basic instruction, but also can find the time when I do my service rounds to make an additional stop with my student for 1 minute. And that's how you define basically your golden sentences. Step number 6, you set up a meaningful intervention based on your golden sentences. How do you want to adopt them? Be as specific as possible. What are you going to do to make the curriculum in eatable chunks, as in you eat an elephant sandwich bite by bite? So be as specific as possible. What or who is needed, and describe how you intend to monitor not only the results but also the process. You want to know, have we all done what was agreed on? Were we able to do it every day? Was it small enough to be able to do it every day, to repeat it on a structural basis? And then what was the success it brought us? And finally, you reflect on action, because in your daily practice, you have hardly the time to reflect in action while doing it. But you can reflect on action before you start and when you've finalized your first cycle of your educational design. And you evaluate, has everybody acted as agreed to, at the agreed time, in the agreed way? Did we establish improvement by using your thermometer? Did it become a 5, or is it already a 4.5? And what contributed specifically to that success? And again, you use the same sentences. What was not as successful as expected? Because life is not always a path filled with roses. It's sometimes hard and difficult. And can you define what caused the lack of success? And your final question is, what will be your next smallest step on your path to improvement? And if you look at underachievement no longer as underachievement, but as underlearning, keep in mind that changing or using the solution-focused and change-oriented approach requires that all of you are learning, not only the student, but as a teacher, you have to learn how to implement new behavior, but you also have to learn to deal with new student behavior. As a parent, you have to deal with a different way your children come home, that it's sometimes difficult. Because they may have done something for the first time in their life they really found difficult. And as a student, you had the hardest job at all, because you had not only to learn about new learning content, but you had to learn new behavior. And learning new behavior requires support by your entire ecological system. Well, thank you for all your attention, and I hope that you see that there is still a hope for the future. And I'm looking forward to see you at another time, and maybe to ask some questions right now. There are no questions right now, so either I'm going to bore you for another 9 minutes, and maybe some questions will be raised in the next couple of minutes. And if there are no questions, you may want to have a comment on what I have to say. You may want to ruffle my feathers and see if you can do something with my perspective. Well, that's a very interesting question, Ryan. Thank you. Teresa Boatman said, how do you communicate to parents about the importance of small steps rather than dramatic change? I always, this process starts with already the small step that you start to include them in your conversation, as in, what do we all want to achieve? And I always ask parents, if we set this up for if we set this up for the future, for the next 6 weeks, is it reasonable that we can change the curriculum? Is it reasonable that we can change your child's behavior, that your child may raise his grades from an F to an A? And what do you think that is a reasonable step? And I also ask parents, what are you willing to contribute to setting that step? And if they say, well, I'm happy to sit down with my child every day for half an hour, I often tell them, I love your idea, but it's not going to work, because what is the time of the day you get your child home? Well, you get him home at the end of the day when your child is very tired. He's worked his ass off and tried to do better. You are very tired. You have to cook your dinner. One has to go to sports field. One has to go to music lessons. And then you have this child. Is it reasonable that you expect yourself to be able to invest an individual half hour between 6 and 8 o'clock in the evening with this child? And quite often parents say, oh yeah, that's a bit too much. Okay, well, how can we make it smaller? Okay, you can invest 5 minutes. Brilliant that you can invest 5 minutes. That's what I'd love. How are we going to set it up? how are we or how are you going to set the stage for those 5 minutes? And what you do is, if you tune in and you see that every actor of the ecological system contributes one thing, most of the time parents accept that we aim for a smaller step, because what we basically need is, we need a result at a very short notice. Parents want a result at a short notice, and a big result, you can't achieve that in 6 weeks. So you can take them along in the pathway, as in how to become realistic. I hope that answers your question, Teresa. There's a question or remark from Matt Fugate, and he states, I love the paradigm shift from underachievement to underlearning. This has tremendous implication, not only for a child's academic achievement, but for the social, emotional well-being as well. What can teachers and administrators do to ensure that they make effective changes in the school culture that will help others to come to understand this important distinction? Well, again, that's about taking baby steps in your school. It's about looking with each other, and you can set the same 6-7 steps I made. What do we experience currently as a problematic situation in our gifted education? And underachievement may be one point, but you can also say, well, it might be the complexity of tuning into every student's individual needs. Okay, if that is what we define as a major problem, what would we like to achieve, and what is our next aim? And is it realistic that we want to achieve that within 6 weeks, within 3 months, or within a year? And keep in mind that the systemic approach and the systemic change takes time for setting steps. And I sometimes take teachers to the big hall, and I give them all a bunch of papers, A4 or folio, and we take our aim and we place the aim at the far end of the hallway. And every teacher has that pile of paper with his or her name on it. And I said, okay, that's where we aim to go to. Take place in the hallway at a distance that you think that you as an individual teacher are in your ecological system of the school, where you are in regard to that aim and that objective. So everybody stands at different places, and then I'll ask them, now you're going to take your first step. Lay out what is the first step you want to take. Write it down on your paper and place that on the floor. And then set one step forward. What's the next step? So I let them make their own pathway to the joint objective of the school, and that way they create their own trajectory towards the goal. I see there's only 3 minutes left, so I'm going to address Wendy's question. When students underperform in advanced classes, should they remain in the class? This may be an issue of a number of seats available in advanced courses are limited. How do you advise teachers who want to remove students from the class? Please don't remove them from their class, because basically what you do is you let achievements again prevail above learning. So what you have to define is whether or not the child is learning in the current situation in the regular classroom. If you can really make clear that this child is reaching to his or her zone of proximal development, you're going to see what is needed under that circumstances and what is the place where we can offer that best. That's point one. The second reason you don't want to remove them from their advanced classes or their special project is that every child in your school needs peers to develop themselves socially, emotionally. And for almost every child in your school, you make the arrangement that they meet their peers in the regular classroom. But if there's only one of you who's gifted, one of you that can think at warp speed, where are your peers? If they're not there, it's really, really difficult, if they're not there, to develop a stable, or to have a stable, developed inter and intrapersonal understanding and functioning of yourself. I think this is where we are. It's in my time exactly 16:30. So that I think I did it for an hour. May I give the mic back to the organizers, to Wendy O'Ryan?